Hey, so regrettably, sometimes the Old Testament is overlooked when we do Christian teaching. And I think that the Old Testament is so unbelievably rich to understand what Jesus is really doing. And I think John presents an awesome story of that in John chapter 2. We're talking about that today. Jesus and the Old Testament in the book of John.
Today's episode is brought to you by Logos. Learn more about the world's best Bible study software at logos.com/themove. Today's episode is on John chapter 2, verses 13 to 22.
And as always, have you read it? If you haven't, it's in the description below. Take a moment and we'll put 10 minutes on the clock and we will start in 3, 2, 1, go. Where you at?
Well, we were talking about this progression that we've been seeing, and we were actually reflecting back on yesterday's episode where we're talking about, okay, what is Jesus doing? He's turning water into wine. One of the major pieces was we see Jesus kind of discarding the old system and replacing it for a new system, right?
Okay.
How do we see that in the first one?
Well, so in the first chapter?
In the first miracle.
Oh, where there's the water to wine. There's the sense of the ritual emblems and Passover. We know what I'm talking about.
The stone jars
the
that are
stone
used
jars,
for ritualistic cleansing.
and he's bringing a new thing out of them.
He's replacing that way of dealing with God with the new wine, which is his blood. Second miracle we see is now focused.
But notice, real quick, he's not doing away with them as much as he's bringing a new thing out of them.
Yeah. Second one is all about the temple. We see Jesus coming into the temple. We're familiar with the story. We'll dive into this a little bit more. But then towards the end of this passage, what is the thing that he's bringing up out of this idea of temple and place of worship? It's not about that, but it's actually about...
I got my mind somewhere else. I'm listening to what you're saying.
It's actually about his body.
Yes.
So we see that the temple is his thing, but then Jesus draws the allusion to his body. So we see this kind of replacement, it's maybe not the best word, but this reclarification, this opening up, this deepening of what they believed was super important at the time.
Well, I would use the word fulfilling.
Fulfilling. That
Right.
is a word that has been used.
Right? He's fulfilling what all of these things actually point to and are about. Right? So that all of the elements that we have seen thus far that harken back to the Old Testament, if you go and read chapter 1, there are all these Old Testament elements. There is light, there is darkness, there is the Spirit hovering over, there is Elijah, there's the prophet, all of these things. There's the stairway, Jacob's ladder, right? All of these things, and they're all finding their meaning and fulfillment around
The person of Jesus.
the person of Jesus. And so that if you were to do a sort of rendering of the first chapter, the prologue has been about, to some degree, the beginning. And hearkening back to the beginning of the book, Genesis, light, dark, that whole deal, right? And then you have, in the story, you have a man who emerges in the Old Testament who, after the beginning, you have the fall, you have that whole deal, you have the story of Babel, right? But immediately in Genesis 12, you have who? You have Abraham.
Yeah.
Abraham shows up, right? And then after Abraham and the story of the patriarchs and all of that,
Yeah. Isaac.
you have Isaac, Jacob, you have Israel that becomes a nation there in Egypt, right? So these are like the major sort of highlights. It seems as though John is doing the same thing.
Okay.
Chapter 1, creation, introduces Old Testament elements, right? There is this man that appears who is the fulfillment of all of these things. He is the seed of Abraham,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And then there are, in keeping with the Old Testament, there would be Exodus. There's Genesis, then there's Exodus, right? Look at how he starts the story of the temple.
He goes up to Jerusalem.
Goes up to Jerusalem, but look at what feast is being celebrated.
Passover. And this is the good question because we see, like in the Synoptic Gospels, every story puts the cleansing of the temple towards the end. And this was actually a question I was thinking about as we were preparing for this episode is, why does John move this to the beginning, if not for some creative or some kind of thematic purpose? And you're putting forward it's because he's tracing this journey.
Yeah, he's doing this story. So what is it that happens at Passover? If you remember Passover, it begins in Exodus chapter 12. It's right around the last plague, right? Prior to the last plague, which is the death of the firstborn in Exodus chapter 12, you have the Passover is instituted. And what's going to happen? The angel
the angel of death is going to come, and if you want to make sure that your firstborn doesn't fall under the penalty or the wrath or whatever you want to use for that language, death, if you don't want your firstborn to die, here's what you do. You get an unblemished lamb, right? You kill it, you put its blood over your doorpost, and by that blood, you and your family will be saved.
So whoever's in and under the blood is saved. Now, what happens immediately after the Passover, once there is a cry that goes out into Egypt, right? Egypt has been an oppressive regime in the life of the nation of Israel, right? Mm-hmm. And they have been oppressing them to the point where they're slaves, right?
Right.
This Passover happens. What happens immediately after Passover?
God takes them to himself, develops a place where he says, I want to be with you. I'm bringing you out to make me a sanctuary so that I might dwell with you.
Right, make me a sanctuary. But right before that, Passover happens. Angel of death comes. Pharaoh loses his child, his firstborn. And he decides to let the people go free. And Exodus 12 tells us that the people are driven out of Egypt.
Okay.
Driven out from under the oppression. Let's go to John 13. Look at this. Jesus goes into the temple, and what does he find?
He sees not the people that are there to be worshiping in spirit and truth, but he sees oxen, sheep, pigeons, money changers, people abusing the system.
Oh, abusing the system. I would even go as far to say that he sees economic oppression, right, on the very people. This temple is supposed to stand not as a prescribing instrument of how the people come to God, but remember, this temple is supposed to stand as an emblem, an image, a touch point, a contact point of faith,
where you can have access to God,
of how God would come to man. Mm-hmm. But the people can't. Why? Because in the way there's this obstacle, and they're being oppressed, right?
So what happens to the people? What does God do on their behalf? He drives them out so that connection can be restored,
right? And who is it that he drives out? He's driving out those who have been oppressing the people. Back in the Passover, he drives his people out into liberty from their oppressors. Yeah. But in this telling of it, it's his very people, the religious leaders, the money changers, who have become the oppressors of those that God had liberated back then. You see this imagery, right? And so he makes this whip and drives them out of the temple. And then this language that he pours out the coins of the money changers. Doesn't grab, he just pours it out. Almost like an offer, like, this is not a part of this. Pours it out, right? And he says, take away all of these things. Now notice what happens. I'm telling you, man, it's like the story in reverse of Exodus. The Jews come up to him, verse 18, and what do they say?
What sign do you show for us for doing these things?
Do you remember when Moses came?
We need a sign.
You see it?
Yeah.
We need a sign. And then he gives them the sign. And
the sign is, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up.
And what is it that they identify with? They identify so heavily with the temple because they identify that they're the free people, and they're not seeing themselves correctly as what they're participating in, right? And then he identifies that you, and the imagery here, you think temple, but this is really temple, in keeping with what John has been doing. That this new thing is the old thing, but the old thing has been misunderstood because we're not recognizing the new thing. Because the thing is him, not the temple. But the way you're desecrating the temple, you can't correctly understand him, right? You see this? And so what we have here is that Jesus comes, identifies himself with temple, and he himself is pointing that he is going to bring in liberty that the temple was describing. He's going to be the fulfillment of Passover, all of these elements, again, all around him. All right? So that's where I'm at with that.
That's good. That was like a flood of information. I'm not even sure how to follow that back up.
Well, I mean, I think that John is, this is why John is called he's like the super theologian of the Gospels, because he puts all of these things in this compact sort of way.
He has the privilege of doing something that Luke doesn't get to do, because Luke's going around taking a historical account. Yeah. He's just, these are the details. This is the order more or less in what had happened. John's like, okay, I've had some time to think about this thing. I'm developing themes and ideas. I'm trying to call your attention towards this thing that Jesus is doing.
Yeah.
John is the gospel that people are kind of more so intended to read over and over with meditation and thinking about these ideas.
Yeah. And if I could draw it just to the practical, it's like, man, what's like? Cause this is something we were talking about this last episode. What's the takeaway here? What's the story being told here? And the takeaway we keep finding is that the story is,
it's not about the rituals. It's not about the temple. It's about Jesus.
It's about Jesus, man, and who he is, the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world. He's coming in to liberate the oppressed, to heal the brokenhearted. And him, this is what John's all about. John finishes, John chapter 20. We write these things so that you might believe on
him.
Yeah. Right? So we're going to go overtime for just a quick sec. Right? We're going overtime. A lot of overtime in John. Where's your story at? What are the elements in your story? Like we've talked about this that are piecing together. If you watch some of the previous episodes, like we talked about receiving the revelation, right? Receiving his word over your life. Right? How do you make sense of the different elements that you've seen in your life, right? Like how did you make sense of the different elements that you saw play out in the way Spirit led your life? Mm-hmm. I would suggest, and I know in your story, that as you brought them and put them all together and gave them over to him,
something emerges. Yeah, there's I know for me in my life, there's a tendency to think, oh, maybe this just was happenstance. This was just a coincidence.
Yeah.
But it comes I think there's a real beauty that you can behold and experience when you realize, no, there's no such thing as coincidence or anything like that. You might not be able to know how all the pieces connect yet, but when you bring them to God and allow him to do that connecting for you, you see a beautiful story emerging.
Yeah, because we could say like, well, why does he put Passover here? Why does this language of him driving them out of the temple? Why identify himself with them? Because he's correctly positioning the story in him. And so we would encourage y'all to correctly position your story and receive what he is saying about liberty, about you, about your name, about the calling he has on your life, about the way he sees you and the work, the incredible work that he has done in order for that to emerge. Right?
That's right. Hey movers, I recently got to travel to the Logos headquarters and ended up recording several tutorials on how you and I can get more from our Bible study using Logos. To see the entire playlist of videos, visit logos.com/themove and get 10% off any Logos 8 product you want. logos.com/themove.